Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the White Coat Club. My name is Nicole, and I'm one of the counselors at Moon Prep. Today, I have Muskan here with me, and we're going to be talking about the SAT and ACT prep. Things to know, what to do, what not to do, all of those good things. So don't forget to like and subscribe to get more admissions and BSMD medical school admission advice going forward. So I have
Yeah,
Muskan here with me. Yeah, hey, do you want to start us off and get
yeah,
going?
for sure, for sure. Like Nicole said, we're going to be talking about SAT and ACT prep today. It's definitely a little bit of a daunting topic for a lot of students because, there's not that much information available from schools, and a lot of students get information online, and it can just be really overwhelming and confusing. So hopefully we can break it down into a more manageable stream of information for you guys, and hopefully it helps alleviate some of the anxiety you might have around these tests. So I guess we can get started with ideal timelines. Nicole, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Great place to start. So, for us, usually, ideally, our students will begin testing in the fall during their junior year and then be done with that testing in the spring of junior year. So, I know there's different timelines and schools will offer exams, usually not until the spring. And some students want to wait to see, oh, my school is offering a test in March, so I'll just wait and take my first test there. We really, really encourage students to begin to test prior to. Um, the biggest weight that the test gives for the college admissions process, for the, holding us up on our end of it, is figuring out your college list. So ideally, we want to have the scores ready to go so we know exactly what your scores are, where you're at least having some type of ballpark in the fall to start navigating the conversations around the list of schools that you're going to apply to, especially when it comes to those BSMD students. Then figuring out kind of a plan moving forward. So, making sure we have the scores in when discussing the list, planning in the spring so that way we can begin writing essays in the late spring, early summer. So if we're still waiting on testing through, early spring you test and then we're waiting again, not every month is offering an exam, especially for each exam. So then you may get stuck testing into the late summer. If you're still looking for a score into the late summer, it's going to hinder what schools you actually apply to. And then, trying to figure that out last minute is a little bit of a rush. We want to know, 90% where you're applying really before summer even starts. So we can kind of start to plan for those applications, for those essays and things like that. Usually the summer we'll dive into the personal statement, we'll dive into the supplemental essays, like I said, scholarship applications. So if we're still waiting for exams, it's just going to hold that process up a little bit more. Like I said, sometimes tests are only offered on specific dates, not every month. So if you're in sophomore year right now or you're in junior year right now, definitely start to think about this and plan your testing. These months and the dates of the exams are posted months and months in advance. Usually 6 months in advance, you can see when the tests are available. So keep all of it in mind. Really pay attention to things surrounding important dates, vacations. Every year I have a student who says like, "Oh, I'm going to test in February or something," and then, "Oh, wait, I have a wedding that I can't be there for. We're going to be on vacation." And some kids want to test in the fall and they're all ready, but oh, I'm not going to do it because it's homecoming day. And there's always things that are going to come up. So really just be prepared. We say this all the time, but in that timeline, you know, really, really start to think about the dates in the early fall, mid fall, late fall of junior year as your first and second tests, and then going forward into the early spring to potentially test again if needed. Have you had students that do
Yeah,
the same thing where they kind of drag their feet and they are like, "Oh, I'm going to test," and then something has come up?
yeah, all the time. And another thing I wanted to add was a lot of students don't realize that it's not always going to be the same location that the test is offered at time and time
Yeah.
again. So, I've had students who've waited until August of their senior year, and, a lot of students will make that mistake. They'll wait till the last possible test. Like there's maybe 3 or 4, I think there's 3 test dates that students can take in senior year that would still allow them to apply to their colleges by the deadline. And those run out so quickly. So I've had
Yes.
students have to drive hours and hours to get to their testing location because they just don't have any spots left.
Hmm. Yeah, that's happened to me before too, especially with students in like more of a rural area. There's no guarantee that you're going to get a seat for it. And especially if you drag your feet, really pay attention to the dates that you can register. So the dates are posted months in advance of when the tests are going to be held. It's just a matter of what date can you then register for those exams? What's the cutoff date? I've had students miss the cutoff date. They're like, oh yeah, I'm planning to take it this month. And then I'll say, you've registered, right? The date has already passed to register. So, you can't just on a whim decide like, oh, I'll just test tomorrow. No big deal. Really be intentional. All of this, you get one shot at admissions. All of this is really to say very much so be intentional, really plan it out, think about when you're going to test, think about what makes sense for you. But ideally, especially if you're a BSMD student, you want to be doing it the earlier the better in junior year. So this kind of goes into now strategy, so what is the strategy? We kind of mentioned, maybe you'll take 2 exams, maybe you'll take 3 exams. I know I get a ton of questions about should I take both exams? How many times? What's too many times? I usually get into the conversations with students with like, where's your time best spent when we're starting to get into, summer before senior year. Let me just take one more crack at it. And it's kind of a decision between where's your time going to be best spent. But I know with your experience, you've tutored before and have tons of experience in that category. So what do you feel kind of about how to prepare best and like really get that strategy for the SAT and the ACT?
Yeah, sure. So preparing for the SAT, ACT is really a marathon and not a sprint. It takes a lot of careful planning and making sure that you're taking the test that is going to help you showcase your strengths the best. Um, so first of all, it's really important to understand what are the differences between the SAT and ACT. And one thing that I've noticed, I don't know, Nicole, if you've also noticed this, but some regions tend to have preferences. Not necessarily what colleges have preferences for, but like some regions, all the high schools give one test versus the other, and that can
Hmm.
definitely sway a student's opinion.
Yes, definitely. When I was a school counselor in New York on Long Island, it was pretty much an even split. I think the SAT was more popular, but by the time I was leaving there, it was pretty much an even split. Now, as a school counselor in North Carolina, it's primarily ACT. And, times have changed as well. We're almost in a different decade, but I think definitely regionally, for sure, North Carolina is absolutely an ACT state, and it comes in with the state funding as well. Like they fund every high school student to take at least one ACT for free. So it's kind of, they call it an ACT state. So, I have some students who, we work with now who are like, no, I'm going to take, my school offers the ACT. So I'm going to take that. But don't, your school doesn't have to decipher which test you have to take. You're always probably going to take the one that your school offers. It's usually a requirement for attendance purposes, but you don't have to only take that exam.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've had a lot of students kind of fall into that same trap of, oh, my school offers this, or all my friends are taking this, and they feel like that is the test that they have to commit to. But I would actually encourage students to try to take a mock test of both the SAT and ACT at home first. It is getting a little bit more complicated considering the SAT now has an online version, and they just came out with a newer version of the ACT, which is the enhanced version. But a lot of the content on these tests remains similar from even, with these new changes being implemented. So you can look up even an older version of these tests and just try to take one at home to get a feel for what types of questions each test asks. The biggest difference, I would say, between the two is obviously the addition of a section on the ACT which is the science section, and it can be kind of confusing for students to try to prepare for that. Considering that like it's totally different from what they've probably seen in school or from what they see on the SAT, but it's definitely a consideration to take when you're trying to decide which exam will be best for you. I will say just a side note that the enhanced ACT or like the newer version of the ACT, they have made the science section optional. I've gotten a lot of questions about that from students. And so far, I have been encouraging students to still take the science section, especially if they are applying to BSMD. Considering that you're going into such a science heavy field, I think it's important to showcase those skills. I don't know, Nicole, if you've run into the same questions from students or what you would recommend.
Yeah, I've gotten exactly the same questions, and I'm actually working with a student currently who is did not do the science portion. And they're like, well, what should I do if I'm taking it again? I'm like, if you're gonna, I know this science is a little bit different. It's not so much, needing to know the science terms and all of it. It's really kind of the depth and understanding of it's, I think it's kind of a little bit more like reading comprehension and like following directions, versus like having that knowledge of, AP Chem and things like that. But I think you should absolutely take it, especially if you're gonna be a BSMD, BSCO, applicant, you know, having that science on there, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And I completely agree with you. The science section of the ACT, in my experience, and in my experience of teaching students, doesn't necessarily require students to have taken, all of the AP science courses, contrary to popular belief. It is a lot of reading comprehension, graph analysis, basic statistical analysis as well. So it's definitely worth at least giving both a try. Once you're done taking the SAT and the ACT at home and you can score them yourself, I would recommend when you're taking these at home to try to take them under testing conditions. So stay in a quiet place, take it timed. Don't give yourself unlimited time because that is something that can vary from test to test, although the new version of the ACT does say that you get more time, so it should be a little bit more equivalent to the SAT. But regardless, make sure that you're timing yourself. Um, Once you have those scores, there's some score equivalency charts online to see which one you scored best on. Obviously, if you get a 1300 on the SAT and then 36 on the ACT, it's pretty easy to tell. But once you're kind of in those ranges, in the mid ranges especially, um, and it's hard to tell, there's online charts that you can use that try to equate the two tests to see, like, if you got a 1300 on the SAT, what does that mean? You would get on the ACT, if both tests were equalized, and then you can see which one you scored better on based on that comparison. If there isn't a huge difference, you can pick whichever test to take. And by huge difference, we usually mean within 1 to 2 points of the ACT. So if you convert your SAT to the ACT and the margin between your two scores is only a couple points, at that point, I would say it's up to personal preference. A couple points can really just, be like the difference of what math concepts were you tested on that particular form, or what reading passages you got, if they were easy for you to understand or more difficult. So I wouldn't really stress out too much if it's just a couple points here and there. The general recommendation that I've given to students in the past is that students who prefer science and math, which is a lot of the BSMD students, have enjoyed taking the ACT more, whereas a lot of students who enjoy English and reading in school tend to prefer the SAT. But this is, once again, not a perfect science. You should take both tests, see which one you feel more comfortable with, and which one you score better on before deciding which one to take. Another key consideration in deciding which one to take is which one the schools that you want to apply to will accept. But for the most part, I think all colleges will accept either or. Nicole, have you come across any exceptions that you can think of schools that only prefer one or the other?
No, I think was it Sophie Davis that only wanted ACT at some point, but I think that that's since passed. But no, pretty sure every school, and that was only for BSMD specifically. But no, every school will really take any exam. So not much worry, not much worry there. But I think it was a really great point that you made earlier about taking the practice tests under testing conditions. I think that's what, sometimes psychs students out a little bit. I have so many kids who will say, well, my practice tests are great, I'm doing so well. And then when they take the actual exam, it's definitely not as high. I think A, that's always to be expected. But then B, I think the large majority of, so why that's so expected is because we're not actually taking it in the same time constraints and things like that. We're just, being a little bit more lackadaisical with how you're answering the practice questions.
Yeah, that's really true. I've had, too many students kind of fall into the trap of, oh, I'll recognize it on test day, like, oh, it's multiple choice. I'll know what to pick on test day. And I feel like if you're not actively testing yourself, like you will when you show up for your actual exam, it's really difficult to predict. And you can't, if you're getting a 1300 at home, I mean, this is kind of like obviously the opposite situation that I'm talking about, whereas like some students will get really high scores at home and then, not do so well on test day. But then there's like the opposite side of that where a lot of students will be like, oh, I'm getting 1300, but don't worry, I'll be able to pull a 1500 on test day. So you really want to make sure that the testing conditions that you have at home are as accurate as possible so that you are predicting your scores as accurately as possible before you go in and actually take the exam. So,
Mhm.
well, a little bit more background on these practice tests. It is best to take practice tests from official test makers. So for SAT, that's College Board. For ACT, it's just the ACT company. And then also a lot of these test providers will also give you explanations for why an answer is right or why it's wrong. It's always best to, make sure that you're getting understanding of the concepts and not just, a very shallow explanation for why one was right and why the others weren't. In terms of materials slash classes, this is a very popular question that I get is, oh, what book is best to buy? Or, I want to sign up for XYZ class that's offered in my city. Is this worth the money? It's really difficult for us to provide recommendations on things like that because we obviously don't always live in your city. We don't know what the quality of the test prep that you want to invest in is like. I would say that in terms of books, first of all, be very careful and selective of which ones you think are the most representative of the current exam. A good way to discern this is to look at reviews for the books online, and then also, once again, to look at if the test makers themselves have released any types of books, then those might be more accurate than third-party resources. And then going back to the classes for preps, like we said, it's so difficult to make a recommendation. There's just, a million options out there. And then there's also sometimes there's classes that are only offered by one specific tutor in one specific city. So it's really hard for us to know. But you really need to use reviews to make decisions on these, either looking on Google reviews or word of mouth. And then also you want to actually see whether or not if you go into class, are they teaching you the concepts from scratch so that you can, even if you're presented with a different problem on test day, you can refer back to those concepts and still be able to solve it? Or are you just being given problem sets and they're just grading them to see how many you get right and how many you get wrong without much teaching taking place? That's a really important way to differentiate these. And because there is so much competition these days with classes, a lot of them will offer you a free class, or if you ask if you can just demo one session, they'll be able to usually do that for you. So that's nice so that you can really get an understanding of what their teaching philosophy is. Do you have anything to add on prep materials or classes, Nicole?
Yeah, so a couple things that I was thinking about. I actually looked back, and Montclair State University BSND program does not accept the ACT. That was another one. But I mean, that's one out of all of them.
Mhm.
So, but always still make sure. The other major thing, and I think a lot of students when they're taking exams and practicing, they're averaging up their scores. They're almost creating their own super score, or their own composite, where these schools will not, a lot of these schools do not take a super score for the BS&D programs. Regular undergraduate admissions, sure, but many, if not most, of the BS&D programs are not going to take any type of super score. They want they want that high score all in one sitting. Where I know sometimes when I talk to students, they're like, oh, my practice exams are like a 35. It's like, well, is that in one sitting, or are you taking some averages out, from different pieces of different exams? So just
Mhm.
definitely something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. For the listeners who might not know what super scores are, do you mind explaining that really quickly?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Good idea. So a super score is essentially if you're taking the exam more than once and say, for the SAT, if on the math you do better during one session than you do on the next, but the reading, you do better on the first session versus the other one, you can take those two scores and combine them to make a higher score. So, like quickly, for example, if you get like a 600 on math and a 500 on reading, and you have an 1100, and then you get a 500 on math, a 600 reading, some kids will take both 600 and make it a 1200. And you can do that for regular admissions. That's called a super score. You're taking one piece from each exam and you're making the highest score possible. It's the exact same concept for the ACT. For BS&D programs, they want one score. They do not want you to take bits and pieces from different exams and make a high score. They want that score to be the high score that you have. If they're saying, the minimum is a 34 ACT, they don't want you pulling from different exams. They want a 34 in one sitting.
Yeah, that's really good advice, because it gets so confusing with all the different programs that students want to apply to keep track of which schools will accept what. I think a good rule of thumb is if you can't tell on the website, if you're not sure, just, go ahead and contact the school, either, contact the admissions office by phone or by email. It's better to get an official answer from the admissions team than to just, sit there in suspense. I've had students do
Absolutely.
that and
Yeah,
they have to like wait for an actual answer, and I'm like, well, let's take some initiative here and just ask, because I know it's a little daunting, especially as a high school student, to reach out to these colleges, but I think that it will only help in the long run.
absolutely agreed.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. In terms of more on test prep and tutoring, Moon Prep does offer tutoring. We have an in-house SAT, ACT tutor, so that's also something to look into. So if you have purchased a certain amount of hours, they can be applied towards tutoring in-house as well. And you can ask your counselor, and they can set up an introductory meeting with the SAT, ACT tutors that we have on board, and you can try to see if that would be a good fit for you as well.
Yeah.
Um,
A lot of our
and
students will
then go ahead.
use a combination of both. They'll, use the hours with a tutor, and then they'll also use the hours with, the regular moon prep counselors as well.
Yeah, and I think it also just makes it easier in terms of scheduling. So, you're not having to like remember um, a schedule for a class that you're taking, elsewhere than the moon prep schedule. We have people that work in all time zones, so hopefully that also makes things easier. But
Oh
that's
yeah.
a decision that you can make with, your parents, and then also with your counselor on what to pursue. And then finally, I have a small tip for underclassmen who might be listening. I know that it's, really difficult to listen to all of this maybe a year or two before you have to take these exams. You might be wondering, well, what can I do right now? I would say that one passive way to prepare that I always recommend to underclassmen is to read more. It enhances your verbal reasoning skills. It exposes you to new vocabulary. I think it's just a really great way to be prepping for these exams before you get to the stage of actually taking them. And then also we do have a lot of students at Moon Prep that take advanced math courses. So if you feel like so a lot of the math content on the SAT, ACT will only cover up until the high school pre-calculus class. So if you've already taken geometry, you've already taken algebra 1, algebra 2, it might also be a good idea to just consider taking it as early as you're done with covering the content. I know we mentioned that junior year is ideally when we would want students to take the test, but if you've been taking advanced math classes and you're done with all of the content review by the end of your sophomore year, there's really nothing stopping you from taking it then as well. So, there's always ways that you can be passively preparing for the exam before you really sit down and start doing practice questions or practice tests. And at any point, if you feel like you've covered the content, that is a good time to start prepping for it, start taking practice tests to see if you might be ready to take the real deal.
Yeah. I know we talked about, thinking about super scores, who accepts them, who doesn't. Definitely look into that. There are some BSMD programs that are test optional. I have had students who say like, oh, well, can I just not worry about it? No, we're going to test, we're going to see what you get. We're not going to focus on the test optional. That's usually for like kind of very, very last case scenario for some students. We want to absolutely, take the test very, very seriously. One of the most important pieces, unfortunately. And then that's why we're here too. You get your scores and everything is going to be another assessment. Once you have your scores, sit with your counselor. That's what we're kind of doing right now is, sitting down with students and saying, okay, what are your first two scores looking like? What avenue are we going into? How much higher do we think we can get this score? What would be realistic for you? What were your goals? What were your, dream schools? How realistic are they at this point? Where can we kind of go from here and really navigating, the next steps in terms of making that list, which is, one of the most important pieces. But other than that, anything else that you have to add?
No, not really. I think we covered everything. But if you have specific questions, like Nicole mentioned, the best practice is to just reach out to your counselor. They can help guide you in your specific circumstances and based on like your specific goals. So that's always just, best thing to do is shoot us an email and we'll be more than happy to help.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the upcoming episodes, and we'll see you then.